last speaker, Professor Tan, and co-author is Professor Park is sitting there. Professor Kita Govindasamy is not available here. And you have only 15 minutes.
I'll do my best.
Okay.
Right. So good afternoon and thank you for your time. So the period since the death of Kim Jong-il in December of 2011 has been followed by a period of great uncertainty on the Korean Peninsula. We have seen there were initial hopes that the leap year agreement of February 2012 will lead to a greater period of stability, but scarcely had the ink was dry on the leap year agreement, then North Korea went ahead with yet another test of the Taepodong missile. More recently, though, the North Korea, as you know, has been involved in a massive war of words in the so-called March 2013 crisis, with another missile test in December 2012, a nuclear test in February 2013, and an unprecedented level of rhetorical vitriol against the ROK and the US. So, set amongst these developments, much of the media spotlight has been focused on the US-ROK alliance relationship in dealing with these North Korean provocations. In so doing, however, it's unfortunate that it has left ASEAN out of the limelight, which is somewhat understandable given that most ASEAN members take comparatively little interest in Korean Peninsula affairs. However, excuse me a second. Now, given the fact that the period since in more recent times has seen the massive increase in commercial relations between ASEAN members and the ROK, most of ASEAN members have been more interested in ensuring stability on the Korean Peninsula in safeguarding their own economic interests. However, my colleagues and I have determined that there's sufficient ground to suggest that ASEAN does have the potential to take a much more significantly increased role as a sort of a third-party mediator in facilitating a soft landing for the DPRK through capacity building. We propose to introduce this in the following sequence. First, we'll begin with a very brief analysis of North Korea's apparent Byeongjin strategy, which has emerged in the periods following the succession of Kim Jong-un. Second, a very brief look at what ASEAN is. Due to constraints of space and time, I can only focus on two members of ASEAN, namely Vietnam and Singapore, before looking at ASEAN as an institution in its own right. So in this sense, then, we'll be looking at ASEAN's capacity for assisting in North Korean economic and social reform, on the grounds that, for one, North Korea has shown increasing interest in Vietnam's Doi Moi or renovation program of economic reform, as well as in learning from Singapore's own experience of economic modernization. Before moving on to looking at ASEAN as an institution and its potential role in capacity building in North Korean political and security through confidence and security building measures. Now, although all of this suggests that ASEAN can take an increased role with regard to the Korean Peninsula, I would have to conclude by emphasizing that ASEAN is only a middleman. It's more of a third-party mediator. It does not have the kind of dominant role that is enjoyed by the US with regard to Pyongyang. Okay, am I speaking too fast? Oh, it's a bad habit. If I'm speaking too fast, please raise your hand, okay? It's a very bad habit of mine. Yeah. So I'll look very briefly at the nature of North Korea's Byeongjin strategy. Now, a look at the period that has followed the death of Kim Jong-il and the succession by his third son, Kim Jong-un. As I pointed out earlier, you had the leap year agreement of 2012, following talks between the US led by Special Envoy Glyn Davis and his DPRK counterparts, leading to the leap year agreement under which the North Koreans agreed to suspend missile and nuclear testing as a quid pro quo for economic and humanitarian aid. But by mid-March, the North Koreans had already announced their decision to launch another missile test, which occurred in April of 2012. More recently, December 2012 saw yet another missile test. There was another nuclear test, the third in February of 2013. And you also had the closure of the Kaesong Industrial Complex in April 2013, which was accompanied by an unprecedented level of rhetorical vitriol against the ROK and Japan. But I think the media's focus with all these provocative actions, my colleagues and I do acknowledge the provocative nature of these actions, but we also point out that during the same period, Kim Jong-un also announced increased interest in undertaking economic reform. Take a look at the June 28th policy, which was announced on that date in 2012, under which Kim Jong-un announced an increased level of autonomy to factories to raise the living standards of the people. There was also a call to permit North Korean farmers to keep a larger share of their crop, thereby recognizing that there was in fact grounds for addressing the social needs of the North Korean people. My colleagues and I, along with many other members of the academic community, believe that North Korea has adopted a so-called Byeongjin strategy, which I believe translates as parallel track, in which the North Koreans are seeking to simultaneously seek economic development as well as development of their nuclear missile program. Now, in some ways this might seem contradictory, given that by pursuing missile and nuclear programs is only increasing the level of international ostracism that North Korea faces. But if you look at things from the North Korean point of view, there are in fact grounds to suggest that the North Koreans are driven by a very cold and calculated form of logic that is very sensible from their point of view. Now, I think one important event that hasn't been exactly addressed by many scholars so far in this field is the impact of the Arab Spring since early 2011, which has essentially demonstrated to Kim Jong-un that continued repression alone cannot guarantee regime survival. I have a bit more detail on this, but I'm running short on time. Now, I think it's quite interesting to note a number of news articles which indicate that even North Korean soldiers posted on the border with China to stop defections have also started to defect themselves. Now, if this is the case, then it may be a sign that food shortages are also starting to affect the North Korean military. Now, given then that the North Korean military is, after all, the ultimate bearer of arms within the country, it is therefore the ultimate instrument of regime loyalty. So in other words, then, the fact that the prospect of a growing number of starving soldiers thereby makes it difficult for Kim Jong-un and his subordinates to maintain and ensure the loyalty of the military. Hence, the urgency of economic reform in North Korea. But by the same token, though, the North Koreans are also afraid of yet another parallel phenomenon, namely the prospect of overly rapid economic reform. In this sense, the North Koreans are extremely fearful of what happened to the communist regimes of Eastern Europe between 1985 to 1991, when Gorbachev's implementation of perestroika essentially led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as the communist regimes of Eastern Europe. Hence Byeongjin, which from the North Korean perspective makes a lot of sense. We believe that the North Koreans are attempting to undertake a program of tightly controlled economic reform in order to address food shortages and other social ills and the adversities faced by the North Korean people in order to ensure regime survival, whilst ensuring the continued loyalty of the old guard in the military, hence the missile and nuclear programs as a means of currying favor. Turning to the potential role of ASEAN, I'll begin with a very brief background on why we chose to look at the potential role of ASEAN and why North Korea seems to be showing an interest in learning from ASEAN. Well, one is the nature of the so-called ASEAN Way, which when ASEAN began to emerge during the 1960s, it basically embraced the Westphalian norm of state sovereignty. In other words, rejecting foreign interference in one's own internal affairs. In this sense, then, the ASEAN way, by ensuring it by focusing on some level of stability between the different members of ASEAN during the 1960s, was crucial in enabling a stable political environment that was hence conducive to attracting foreign investment, economic growth, and industrialization. Please bear in mind that this was the backdrop of the Cold War, with the Vietnam War raging in nearby Vietnam. Furthermore, in more recent times, ASEAN has also expanded on its own institutional capabilities with the ASEAN Regional Way, and in turn arguing that the ASEAN Way within the context of the ASEAN Regional Forum, pushing for a diplomatic culture that is based on diplomacy based on personal ties, trust, consultation, and consensus, without media scrutiny of potentially controversial issues such as human rights, as well as the distribution of food aid. Oh yeah, I forgot to add this point also, but one other point I forgot to mention is that North Korea also enjoys very good relations with all 10 members of ASEAN. In fact, Malaysia is actually the only country in the world whose citizens do not require a visa to visit North Korea. Now, for these reasons, I think there are grounds to argue that the North Koreans have many reasons to view ASEAN as an attractive regional model to learn from. One was if you could take into account the situation that North Korea is facing at present. We are talking about decades of Cold War isolationism resulting from the confrontation with the ROK and the US, which has resulted in decades of economic and industrial output which have been heavily and overwhelmingly skewed towards armaments at the expense of consumer goods. Furthermore, the Juche ideology of self-reliance has also led to North Korea's shunning of participation in the international community, both in terms of diplomatic terms as well as in commercial relations. More recently, the North Korean missile and nuclear programs have also ostracized North Korea in the eyes of the international community, as reflected by the constant imposition of sanctions on the DPRK. I think even more worrying for the North Koreans then is that since between 89 and 91, North Korea's erstwhile patron states, the Soviet Union and the PRC, also established diplomatic relations with Seoul during the same period. In more recent times, though, there was a lot of speculation that the North Koreans under Kim Jong-un were attempting to borrow from China's model of economic reform. However, since the succession of Kim Jong-un, however, it is apparent that the North Koreans are also worried about the practicality of adapting from China's model of economic reform. China is a country of more than 1 billion people, and it has enabled it to hedge against the shock of globalization. North Korea is a tiny, impoverished, and starving country of 22 million, which does not have the same ability to absorb the shock of globalization. Furthermore, the Chinese support for sanctions on North Korea following the 2006 and 2009 nuclear tests also indicated to the North Koreans that China is not exactly a politically reliable security partner. In this sense, the 2010 WikiLeaks episodes indicated that the Chinese diplomats had increasingly come to view North Korea as a strategic liability. Now, seen in this backdrop, then, we argue that the North Koreans have a lot of reason to view Vietnam as an attractive model to learn from. One is, of course, the shared ideological affinity between two socialist states. In a similar light, I did mention earlier, the extent of North Korea's current isolation, and in this sense, it's also paralleled very closely by the extent of isolation faced by Vietnam following its unification in 1975, all the way through the 1980s. Hence, the Vietnam's unveiling of Doi Moi, which translates as renovation, involving agricultural reform to address food shortages, as well as the coordination of state-owned enterprises as SOEs to undertake economic modernization under government control. In later stages of Doi Moi, this also involved government support for small and medium enterprises, as well as increased production of consumer goods, which has resulted in some startling results, such as the fact that by 2010, Vietnam had emerged as the second fastest growing economy in Asia and one of the so-called civilized economies, poised to dominate the manufacturing industry by 2050. It's also possible that North Korea may also be attracted by the symbolism of Vietnam's ousting of the United States during the Vietnam War, given the North Korea's constant diatribes against the US military presence in the ROK. In this sense, then, we note the massive increase in the numbers of North Korean trade delegations to Hanoi since 2007, and also this statement by North Korean Prime Minister Kim Jong-nam during his August 2012 visit to Hanoi. I'd love to let you read it, but I'm being pushed for time here. Sorry, Prof. Park. The other country which North Korea has shown increasing interest in learning from in terms of economic modernization is Singapore, which may seem a bit surprising given that Singapore is a highly developed capitalist country as well as a close ally of the United States. But if you think in terms of the situation that Singapore faced in the 1960s, you also again had a rather isolated country, small in size, scarce natural resources, yet which was successful in building a very strong export-oriented economy. Furthermore, you also note the political dominance of the People's Action Party, or the PAP in Singapore, which by its political longevity was able to set and sustain the agenda of economic modernization rather than face political transition. In this sense, it's quite interesting to note that the North Korean references to the North Koreans have made frequent references to the Rasan Special Economic Zone as the so-called Next Singapore. There have been a lot of quotes on that in the media, as well as in recent times increasing upgrades to the infrastructure around the Rasan SEZ, which may enable the North Koreans to build new trade links linking Japan, North Korea's east coast, and Russia. And furthermore, following the Banco Delta Asia affair in 2005-2006, there was also an increasing North Korean interest in moving financial assets to Singapore as a more secure location for its financial assets. And furthermore, like Vietnam's example in ousting the US military presence, I think the North Koreans are also attracted to the symbolic idea of this episode in 1993, when an American teenager, Michael Fay, was found guilty of vandalism in Singapore and subsequently caned. In spite of Bill Clinton's protest in Singapore, the Singapore government went ahead on the grounds that the US had no jurisdiction over Singaporean law. Hence, once again, underlining the ability of an Asian country to remain true to its identity and rejecting US influence. Further reflecting North Korean interest in Singapore is the activities of the Chosun Exchange, a non-profit organization set up in Singapore but with probably the presumed patronage of the North Korean government. And in this sense, I had a brief email conversation with the founder of the Chosun Exchange, the Singaporean Jeffrey C., who argued that his organization is involved in organizing workshops to help the North Koreans integrate with the rest of the world, particularly crucial given the extent of North Korea's deeply internalized siege mentality and its very limited experience in international commerce and business management. The Chosun Exchange has therefore been involved in running programs for potential entrepreneurs from North Korea. Example, business workshops held by the Chosun Exchange in Pyongyang, as well as organizing study trips for North Korean citizens to study other countries' business models. So in this sense, then, this quote from my conversation with Jeffrey C. seems to indicate growing North Korean recognition of the need to bring in some level of market forces into the North Korean economy to ensure regime survival. Not only this, Jeffrey C. also reaffirmed the position of small and medium enterprises, which was a position similar to that adopted by the Vietnamese ambassador to KL, whom I also interviewed during the same week. Again, the focus on small and medium enterprises to increase the production of consumer goods and therefore address the standards of living in the country. On the institutional level, we also note the potential for ASEAN as an institution as a whole to adopt an expanded role with regard to the Korean Peninsula. Given the extent of ASEAN members' commercial relations with Seoul, there's naturally an interest in stability on the Korean Peninsula. At the same time, this is balanced by the fact that all ASEAN members have generally good relations with Pyongyang. The ASEAN Way, which I mentioned earlier, helps assuage North Korean fears of foreign interference in its domestic affairs. In this sense, I think it's also interesting to note the presence of quite a number of large North Korean communities in various parts of ASEAN, particularly Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. Furthermore, the continuity of the ASEAN Regional Forum's summits that also provides many opportunities for sustaining the process of diplomatic contact between North Korea and the other members of the six-party talks. Hence, ASEAN's potential role as a sort of an honest broker, in other words, a sort of a neutral mediator. As seen in this slide, I think this background offers ASEAN a very strong opportunity to raise its diplomatic profile in assisting in North Korean capacity building to initiate and sustain internal reform in line with the December 2008 adoption of the ASEAN Charter in promoting a genuinely people-oriented community. In this sense, then, there are potential opportunities for ASEAN to build on forays similar to the Chosun Exchange in promoting social enterprise and education projects, which may provide a key in promoting the emergence of a new generation of North Korean economic reform-minded technocrats. In conclusion, I think it's necessary to qualify the extent of ASEAN's potential role in the Korean Peninsula. One is that the ASEAN as yet continues to lack a centralized policy decision mechanism, similar to the so-called alphabet soup of European Union institutions. Hence, the difficulty in ASEAN members in reaching any sort of consensus or using that as a basis for formulating policy. Furthermore, Vietnam and Singapore, although of interest to North Korea, may also have various factors which help these two countries achieve high levels of economic growth, but these factors do not favor North Korea. In the case of Vietnam, Vietnam has faced improving relations with the United States since 1995, and it has no nuclear weapons program. Singapore has a geostrategically located port, a skilled literate population, and at the time of independence, good relations with both the UK and the US. And moving on to ASEAN, then, I think it's fair to conclude then that ASEAN will neither have a dominant role in the Korean Peninsula, nor would I see it as insignificant. Me and my colleagues would tend to see ASEAN as a sort of as a middle ground. It may be seen as a sort of a facilitator through which business skills can be imparted to North Koreans in order to promote the emergence of small and medium enterprises in North Korea, thereby contributing to an improvement in living standards. At the same time, given the ASEAN's role as a neutral mediator, it can also function as a sort of a third-party facilitator that complements the six-party talks. I apologize if I was speaking too fast, but I was being pressured.